Hi, everyone. I'm Julia Pfister, and I would like to welcome you to our first collaboration with the library for our older adults senior art project with the Oceanside Public Library, sponsored by the Friends of the Oceanside Public Library. And I'm Julia again from Studio ACE. Um, so uh, we're going to talk today about feminist art and Faith Ringgold. So let's get started. So I wanted to talk to you about the feminist art movement. Now, up till this moment, we're talking about the early 70s here. Women were usually footnotes in art history. In the most popular art history textbook by Jansen, there were no women included until the 1970s, mostly because Mr. Jansen said he didn't believe that any woman artist was good enough to be in there. And so the feminist art movement, when it came along, was really a movement that was uniquely female. It was not just female artists aspiring to be a part of the male-dominated art world. This movement emerged in the late 1960s amidst the fervor of anti-war demonstrations and civil and queer rights movements, and hearkening back to the utopian ideals of the early 20th century modernist movements. Feminist artists sought to rewrite a falsely dominated art history theory, as well as change the contemporary world around them through their art. They focused on intervening in the established art world and the art history's canon legacy, as well as in everyday social interactions. As artist Suzanne Lacey declared, the goal of feminist art was to influence cultural attitudes and transform stereotypes. Feminist art created opportunities and spaces that previously did not exist for women and minority artists, as well as paved the identity art and activist art of the 1980s. So a lot in there, wasn't there? So this is, again, just about bringing that up to this point. It was mostly male artists that had been heralded, and we're not trying to say that male artists are bad. It's just that women artists are equal to them as well. And this movement just really brought them into the light, and also said, we're also going to have our own movement that perhaps men cannot be a part of. So, and just to establish how well the art that women could do. So feminist artists really sought to create a dialogue between the viewer and the artwork through the inclusion of a woman's perspective. So most art had been from a male perspective. Now we're looking at it from the female's perspective. Art was not merely an object for aesthetic admiration, but could also incite the viewer to question the social and political landscape, and through this questioning, possibly affect the world and bring change toward equality. So it's just about bringing us out into the light. So this artwork that you see here, it might look a little familiar. Mary Beth Edelson used an image of Leonardo da Vinci's famous mural as the base of this collage, to which she affixed the heads of notable female artists in place of the originals, men. Christ was actually covered with a photo of Georgia O'Keeffe. Now, aside from challenging the painting's male-only club, it also confronted the subordination of women often found in religion. This piece quickly became one of the most iconic images of feminist art and reinforced the movement's desire to negate women's absence from much historical documentation. So it was just about bringing women into the light and to show all the artwork that they had done as well. So this installation, A Woman House, encompassed an entire house in residential Hollywood, organized by Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro as the culmination of the feminist art program at the California Institute for the Arts in 1972. 21 all-female students first renovated the house. And then within that, they actually kind of changed the idea of what a house would look like. They had sculptural figure of a woman in a linen closet. The ceiling were covered with fried eggs that would morph into breasts. Many of the artists also created performances that took place within Woman House to further address the relationship between women and the home. As noted by artist participant Faith Wilding, Woman House became the repository of the daydreams that women have as they wash, bake, cook, sew, clean, and iron their lives away. So it's just about changing the dialogue here is really what these female artists were trying to do. So also during the 70s, Shapiro began to theorize what she called a femage, kind of a feminine collage, or a type of art that collaged materials like cloth, paint, and fabric, items which had long been associated with women's activities in the home. In her definition of femage, Shapiro wrote that the style, which simultaneously recalls quilting and cubism, has a woman-life context, and that it celebrates a public or private event, and also could really only be made by women, but understood by all. So Shapiro's use of femage launched her as one of the leading artists in the pattern and decoration movement. And this was a style that emerged in the mid 70s and lasted through the 80s. It kind of brought color back into avant-garde after all that minimalism and conceptual art. In Shapiro's work in particular, pattern and decoration can be seen in the patterns of her vibrant fabrics, which, as with her femage works, really have this feminist subtext, and they refer to quilting, applique, and other crafts. So it's also about bringing women's art back into the forefront. So this anatomy of a kimono is one of the many femages that Shapiro created starting in the mid 1970s. And this was based on the pattern of Japanese kimonos, fans, and robes. Shapiro used the term femage to describe works that combined collage, painting, fabric, embroidery, and other high art and decorative art techniques. And so it was simultaneously highlighting women's relation to those materials and processes. So all these things that would have normally been considered part of a woman's work, the cleaning and the embroidery and fixing up clothing, is now being put into art. So this is kind of really another really highlight of the feminist, really of feminist video art. Semiotics of the Kitchen examines women's bondage within the context of home through the trope of a televised cooking show. In it, we see Rossler as a self-described anti-Julia child as she picks up an alphabetized stream of kitchen utensils, some strange and antiquated, and gives them random names before demonstrating their use with pantomime. The woman and her implements disrupt the familiar system of everyday meanings. So it's again, just taking these everyday objects and saying that we as women can own them now. We're not being told what to do with them. We can do something different. And she did this through this video art, which was really interesting. So the dinner party is one of the most well-known of the feminist art in existence and is now permanently housed at the Center for Feminist Art at the Brooklyn Museum. The installation consists of a large banquet table with place settings for 39 notable women from history and mythology. There's 13 on each side, which kind of alludes to the Last Supper. The settings have gold and ceramic chalices and porcelain plates painted with butterfly designs representing Mother Nature, and also the life-giving properties of being female. By doing this, Chicago offers this unabashed femininity on the plate, rather than a meal cooked by a woman whose identity would be cloaked passively behind her food offering. And in addition to the 39 place settings, there are the names of 99 other women painted on the tiles below the triangular table. So really just a phenomenal outlook on this. And here we can see some of the place settings. This really was to rediscover the lost role models for women. So there have been women that have been very strong throughout history. And so you see women here, such as Virginia Woolf, Eleanor of Aquitaine, St. Bridget, and there's also Joan of Arc and all the female artists. So just all these really powerful, strong women. She wants to say they get to sit at the table too, was really the whole basis behind this. Now, one of the three monumental paintings in Audrey Flack's Vanitas series is this one called Marilyn. And so she's taking Marilyn Monroe. And a Vanita painting was based on usually on Dutch still lifes, but she's making it much more modern. And a Vanita still life meant you better be careful in your life now because it's only fleeting, and time is coming for you. And so you better be good here on earth. So it also kind of alludes to the worldly pleasures and to life's transient nature. So Marilyn serves as a commemorative meditation on life, death, and celebrity. We have traditional symbols of the Vanita, which is like the hourglass and the candle, so time is going away. There's modern ones as well, a photograph and a calendar, still talking about time slipping away. And so it's really just, she kind of contemplates this passage of time in her own life through these self-referential objects. So just being able to show the feminine side of this as well. Now in 1988, it was announced that Jenny Holzer was chosen to represent the US at the 1990 Vienna Biennale, which is a very famous art show in Venice, Italy. The installation by this controversial media artist was intriguing for many reasons, not the least of which was the fact that it represented the first time in the 93-year history of this very prestigious international exhibition that women artists' work had filled the US pavilion. So the symbolic value came at a time of the 1990s. We had political turmoil, financial distress, the AIDS tragedy, and this increasingly conservative attitude towards the arts. Now, certainly women artists continue to face many inequities, but the art is really getting harder and harder to ignore. So it's just this idea now that we're being accepted into this great art historical canon. Jenny Holzer here also, she created truisms, which were provocative statements presented in a visually neutral way. They were unsigned with no explanation or identifying comments of any kind, and she put them all over New York City. They actually started out as black letters on white paper and then turned into billboards. So just saying we are out there. Joyce Kozloff actually played an important part in the beginnings of the feminist art movement and was one of the main figures in the pattern and decoration movement of the 1970s. This artwork includes floral motifs adapted from the harem rooms of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. Decoration, Joyce Kozloff has said, is where painting and sculpture meet architecture. Isn't that cool? For the lobby of One Penn Center, the building that serves as an entrance to the suburban station, she complemented the elaborate Art Deco architecture with two highly decorative and symbolic mosaic murals, which were commissioned by developer Richard Rubin as part of the overall renovation of this 1929 building. This is another wonderful artist, Barbara Kruger. And here she's placing a phrase over a photographic image from a newspaper or magazine. Kruger first worked in magazine advertising and used her graphic design expertise in her art. So using that, all part of it. The slogan in this work refers to images of women in the media, specifically product advertisements designed for women, which up to this point were usually created by men. It is a reminder that most of the media that is geared towards women is based on men's assumptions about women's desires, lives, and ideals, interrogating the belief that women only need material objects to feel happy and that men can keep them under control by those means. So Kruger's work was really very accessible and direct and was very influential among the artists of the 1980s. So that's kind of another important part about feminist idea here is that, that men could keep them under control by the means of what they put out there. But now women are able to do this and kind of control their own destiny. And here is another one here that she did as well. Your body is a battleground. And it's like, but now it should become ours as well. And this is what we do. And we have control over this. Betty Saar, the Rainbow Size Black Contributions Invitational prompted the creation of an extremely powerful and now famous work. In her article, Influences, Betty Saar wrote about being invited to create a piece for the rainbow sign. She said, "My work started to become politicized after the death of Martin Luther King in 1968. But the liberation of Aunt Jemima, which I made in 1972, was the first piece that was politically explicit. There was a community center in Berkeley on the edge of Black Panther territory in Oakland called the Rainbow Sign. They issued an open invitation to Black artists to be in a show about Black heroes. So I decided to make a Black heroine. For many years, I had collected derogatory images, postcards, cigarette box label, ads, and I found a little Aunt Jemima mammy figure, a caricature of a Black slave. Like those later used to advertise pancakes. She held a broom in one hand, and on the other side, I gave her a rifle. In front of her, I placed a little postcard of a mammy with a mulatto child, which is another way that Black women were exploited during slavery. I used the derogatory image to empower the Black woman by making her a revolutionary, like she was rebelling against her past enslavement. When my work was included in the exhibition at the Museum of Contemporary Art in LA in 2007, Angela Davis gave a talk in which she said that the Black women's movement started with my work, this liberation of Aunt Jemima, and she said that was quite a thrill. And this is now in the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive and really continues to ignite that revolutionary spirit. And again, just the idea that we're taking our own images back. So the Guerrilla Girls did these really incredible posters about being a woman artist, and it kind of exemplifies their strategy of using humor to diffuse and break down discrimination and prejudice within the art world. Adopting a tongue-in-cheek tone, they list the advantages that still faced women artists in the late 1980s, like knowing that your career might pick up after you're 80, and in here, not being stuck in a tenured teaching position. So they're just trying to let us understand these crazy things that have gone on before. So Guerrilla Girl Lee Krasner stated, "The world of high art, the kind that gets into our museum and history books, is run by a very small group of people. Our posters have proven over and over again that these people, no matter how smart or good intentioned, have been biased against women and artists of color." So this poster reflects how pervasive that bias was in 1989, despite almost 2 decades of feminist activism. The fact that the Guerrilla Girls are still making posters and appearing globally and implies that this problem still persists to this day. And it's certainly better, but it does still exist. 4 years later after that, the group turned their attention to the permanent collection at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The result was to get their most celebrated poster, "Do Women Have to Be Naked to Get into the Met Museum?" Surveying the works on display in the museum's 19th and 20th century galleries, they tallied the number of female nudes versus the number of male nudes and counted the number of works of female artists versus male artists. Their findings were startling. Not even 5% of the artists represented in the modern galleries were women, while fully 85% of the nudes in those same galleries were female. The image they made to expose this discrepancy features a reproduction of the sumptuous nude in Jean-Dominique Ingres' La Grande Odalisque. When presented to the Public Art Fund of New York City, which had commissioned the design for a billboard, the work was rejected. The Guerrilla Girls, in retaliation, rented advertising space on New York City's public buses, where the posters display caused quite a stir. So women and minority artists were really starting to become a force to be reckoned with, including the inclusion in art history books. Women had always made art, it was just never recognized by the male canon of artists, critics, and art historians. And this is where we're going to intersect with Faith Ringgold, not only a woman artist, but a Black woman artist, and seemingly at the end of the line of all of art that has come to this point in history. So let's take a look at Faith. So Faith Ringgold was born in Harlem, New York in 1930. She is a painter, mixed media sculptor, performance artist, writer, teacher, and lecturer. And she is alive. She's 91 years old. She received her BS and MA degrees in visual art from the City College of New York in 1955 and 59. She is a professor emeritus at the University of California in San Diego. She has received 23 honorary doctorates. Her mother was a fashion designer and her father an avid storyteller. They raised her in an environment that encouraged her creativity. Now, after the Harlem Renaissance, Ringgold's childhood home in Harlem became surrounded by a thriving art scene, where figures such as Duke Ellington and Langston Hughes lived just around the corner from her. Her childhood friend, Sonny Rollins, who would grow up to be a prominent jazz musician, often visited her family and practiced saxophone at their parties. I wanted to share a little bit about Faith's family, who really gave her this great legacy of both activism and creativity. The family's known creative legacy begins with Susan Shannon, and she was an enslaved person who was a quilter, dressmaker, and as her great-great-granddaughter, Michelle Wallace said, a weaver as well. They said Susan lived to be 100, so that there are pictures of her and Betsy, who was a quilter and dressmaker in Jacksonville, Florida, which Ringgold used a lot in her work. So in the photo shown here on top, we see Bingham, Betsy Bingham, Faith's grandmother, is on the porch of her house, and faintly visible above her is a sign that says dressmaking. So Bingham's mother, Susan Shannon, is in the background with one of Betsy's children, possibly Willie, or grandchildren, possibly Willie. Now below is Faith's mother, Willie, and we also see her business card next to her. And this is a photo of her in Harlem. Bingham's great-granddaughter, writer and visual culture scholar, Michelle Wallace, who is Faith's daughter, says that Willie Posey learned her sewing skills from Bingham, as did Willie's mother, Ida Matilda Posey, as well. So just this beautiful long line of creativity that's happening here. Now, because of her asthma, Ringgold explored visual art as a major pastime through the support of her mother, often experimenting with crayons as a young girl. She also learned how to sew and work creatively with fabric from her mother, who learned it from her mother, who learned it from her mother, who we now know had been enslaved at one time. Ringgold maintains that despite her upbringing in the Great Depression era Harlem, this did not mean she was poor and oppressed. She said she was protected from oppression and surrounded by a loving family. With all of these influences combined, Ringgold's future was greatly affected by the people, poetry, and music she experienced in her childhood, as well as the racism, sexism, and segregation that she dealt with in her everyday life. She said, "It's nice to come up in a period where great changes are being made. That was my period, the 30s to the 60s, when radical changes were being made." So we see now she's coming up into the 60s and intersecting with the feminist art movement. In 1950, due to pressure from her family, Ringgold enrolled at the City College in New York to major in art, but was forced to major in art education instead, as City College only allowed women to be enrolled in certain majors. In 1955, Ringgold received her bachelor's degree from City College and soon afterward taught in the New York City public school system. In 1959, she received her master's degree from City College and with her mother and daughters made her first trip to Europe. While traveling abroad in Florence and Rome, Ringgold visited many museums, including the Louvre. And this would inspire her in one of her future quilt series known as the French Collection, which we'll see part of. And this is part of her early work, which was very flat, but really explored the people around her. And so she's, again, just painting what she sees and what she knows. And because she's a female artist and coming up into the 60s, it's starting to be able to be seen as well. So she began her painting career in the 50s after receiving her degree. Her early work is composed with flat figures and shapes. She was inspired by the writings of James Baldwin, Amira Baraka, African art, Impressionism, and Cubism to create the works that she made in the 1960s. Though she received a great deal of attention with these images, many of her early paintings focused on the underlying racism in everyday activities. Now, this actually made sales very difficult. It would disquiet the galleries and collectors as well. These works were also politically based and reflected her experiences growing up during the Harlem Renaissance, themes which of course matured during the civil rights movement and the women's movement. So she's just really a part of all this change that she had actually talked about as well. As we will see, Ringgold liked to work in series, to really taking time to explore different ideas in depth. Here she took her inspiration from artist Jacob Lawrence and writer James Baldwin. She named her first political collection the American People series in 1963, which portrays the American lifestyle in relation to the civil rights movement. The American People series illustrates these racial interactions from a female point of view, which calls basic racial issues in America into question. In a 2019 article with Hyperallergic magazine, Ringgold explained that her choice for a political collection comes from the turbulent atmosphere around her. She said, "It was the 1960s, and I could not act like everything was okay. I couldn't paint landscapes in the 1960s. There was too much going on." This is what inspired the American People series. She said, oil paintings for members only, Watching and Waiting, and the Civil Rights Triangle also embody these themes. And she also had her first and second only one-person exhibitions at the Spectrum Gallery in New York. And I think I did not advance this slide here. So this is the one where she was talking about the Civil Rights Triangle. So talking about that she just had to paint what she was seeing and what was around her at the time. In the early 1970s, Ringgold began making tankas, and these were inspired by a Tibetan form of paintings that were framed in richly brocaded fabric. And she also made self-sculptures and masks. She later utilized this medium in performances in the 70s and 80s. Although her art was initially inspired by African art in the 70s and 80s and 60s, it was not until the 1970s that she actually traveled to Nigeria and Ghana to see the rich tradition of masks that continue to be her greatest influence. The Family of Women, a series that Faith completed in 1973, was inspired by the Dan masks of Liberia. And so we see one of her soft sculptures here that's inspired by that. The face features this gaping hole of a screaming mouth, large round eye holes through which the wearer could see, brightly colored yarn hairs and skinny braids that hang freely. And these again were created in likeness of some of the women and children that Ringgold knew growing up. During the 1970s, Ringgold was involved in the women's movement, and during this time reflects her dedication to promoting the representation of women in the art world. So she is a part of this movement as well. And I just wanted to show you here an actual tanka. I hope I'm getting that pronunciation right. They usually depict a Buddhist deity, a scene, or a mandala. They're traditionally kept unframed and rolled up when not on display. So really kind of fascinating where she's taking, again, all these influences from. In 1972, as part of a commission sponsored by the Creative Artists Public Service Program, Ringgold installed for the Women's House in the Women's Facility on Rikers Island. This was a large-scale mural. It was considered to be an anti-carceral work composed of depictions of women in professional and civil servant roles, representing positive alternatives to incarceration. So Ringgold actually went and asked these women what they would like a mural of, and this is what they said, of women of all colors and positive role models, something for them to strive for as they're moving out. She said they wanted images of freedom, justice, equality, but mostly they wanted an image of hope, of a future. In the words of one female prisoner, a long road leading out of here. So just kind of fascinating how she's bringing this all together. And then we can see over on the right there, some of the one of the protest photographs around this time, we see there are 50% Black women artists. And so trying to bring women artists into the forefront. And this triangular motif that we see here was again from the tankas that we'd seen earlier. So in January 1972, the same month that for the Women's House was unveiled to the female inmates of Rikers, Ringgold's artwork, the infamous feminist art program at the California Institute of the Arts opened Woman House at the college campus. That's the one we just saw a little bit earlier. And she said, "It seems to me that the most important criteria for a successful society is that it meets the needs of its people. The hope was getting the painting might be a step in the right direction toward racial and gender equality, towards a type of collective equality and empathy. But one only need think on Rikers with its crippling bail system, institutional corruption and violence, which for me, this is again, faith speaking, representative of the overarching structure of our criminal justice system in the United States. So to understand that as a society, we are just as far from serving the public as we were in 1972, perhaps even farther." And here we see some of her pictures of her protesting, showing that she is part of this and also part of the movement to get more women artists and artists of color into museums. Ringgold stated that she switched from painting to fabric to get away with the association of painting with Western European traditions. So this is, again, right around that time of pattern and decoration where women are using traditional female materials such as cloth and embroidery in their artwork. In Amsterdam, when she was visiting there, she visited the Rijksmuseum, which became one of the most influential experiences affecting her mature work and subsequently led to the development of her quilt paintings. In the museum, Ringgold encountered a collection of the 14th and 15th century Nepali paintings, which inspired her to produce fabric borders around her own work. So this is will be very important to us later on. When she returned to the US, a new series was born. And in these works, Ringgold took the perspective of an African woman captured and sold into slavery. Her mother, Willie Posey, collaborated with her on this project, as again, Posey was a popular Harlem clothing designer and seamstress, and she really taught Faith everything she knew. Now, this was actually Ringgold's first quilt and final collaborative project with her mother as her mother passed away. And the composition kind of unifies 4 distinct fabrics and a recurring rhythm and frames 30 different faces, which provide a variety of individual expressions. And together, these faces represent the many life stories in Harlem. So again, talking about the people around her. In subsequent years, Ringgold began constructing narrative quilts that portray different aspects of African-American life in the United States. So this is kind of the genesis of where she goes with her quilting work. And here we see her and her mother working on this, which must be a fabulous picture that she treasures. And then in the background there, right above her head, we can see the triangular pictures of the tonkas there. So Ringgold actually quilted her stories to be heard, since at the time, no one would publish her autobiography that she had been working on. So making her worth both, so this artwork here is both autobiographical and artistic. In an interview with the Crocker Art Museum, she stated, "In 1983, I began writing stories on my quilts as an alternative. That way, when my quilts were hung up to look at or photographed for a book, people could still read my stories. Her first quilt story, Who's Afraid of Aunt Jemima, depicts the story of Aunt Jemima as a matriarch restaurateur and fictionally revises the most maligned Black female stereotype." We know that from when we saw Betty Saar's piece. Ringgold's first story quilt was written in 1983, again, as a way of publishing her unedited words. And this really developed into a very unique medium that she created herself. And eventually she morphed Aunt Jemima into a well-dressed Black woman. Quaker Oats noticed this. This was even back then. And the pictures of the pancake boxes feature a younger Black woman wearing a collar and no bandana. And of course, now we know this is even changing and morphing once again due to the Black Lives Matter. So again, this was the last one with her mother. Her mother died after this. So her mother now became her inspiration for a lot of her artwork going forward. So another piece titled Change, Faith Ringgold's over 100 pounds weight loss, engages the topic of a woman who wants to feel good about herself, struggling to the cultural norms of beauty, a person whose intelligence and political sensitivity allows her to see the inherent contradictions in her position, and someone who gets inspired to take the whole dilemma into an artwork. So she's taking personal feelings and things around her and putting them into her artwork. Tar Beach was the first quilt in Ringgold's colorful and lighthearted series entitled Women on a Bridge. And these depicted the fantasies of a spirited heroine and narrator Cassie Louise Lightfoot, who on a summer night in Harlem flies over the George Washington Bridge. Sleeping on Tar Beach was magical, explains Cassie in the text on the quilt. Only 8 years old and in the 3rd grade, and I can fly. That means I am free to go wherever I want to go for the rest of my life. So for Ringgold, this phantasmic flight through the urban night sky symbolizes the potential for freedom and self-possession. My women, proclaimed Ringgold about the Women on a Bridge series, are actually flying. They are just free, totally. They take their liberation by confronting this huge masculine icon, the bridge. She also writes that her father told her the George Washington Bridge is the longest and most beautiful bridge in the world. She proudly adds that it opened in 1931 on the very day that I was born, and that her father had actually hoisted cables during construction. So she's just taking all these points of life and again, this idea of a masculine icon of a bridge and putting it into the feminine world. And so this is another one. This is of the famous bridges. This is one of her doing the double Dutch jump rope on the Golden Gate Bridge. And again, so we start to see the border that's around it and painted within it. And so, and this, it again becomes a type of artwork that Faith became very well known for. And this quilt, I can't remember the year, but it was actually sold for $209,000. So all of her quilts, again, have this united tradition of representational painting with the rich history of quilting in the African American community. So the border here of Maya's Quilt of Life is made from pieced together fabric that frames Angelou, who is surrounded by flowers in her signature pattern African dress and head wrap. Handwritten texts appear on both sides of the center panel with excerpts from Angelou's written works, including Just Give Me a Cool Drink, I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings. So Angela was best known for that work, I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings, depicting her life growing up in Stamps, Arkansas with her brother and grandmother. So this is, again, just this way of celebrating, again, one of another famous woman, like we had seen even in the dinner party of Maya Angelou, but she is painting here in the middle with the fabric frame around it. So this is the story quilt painting entitled Sunflower Quilting Be at Arles. And this is from Ringgold's French collection from after she was inspired after she had visited Europe. And this was a series of 12 quilts that take the heroine, Willia Marie Simone, on a journey through the turn of 20th century Europe. The series tells the fictional story of Willia, a young Black woman who moves to Paris in the early 20th century. This is told through text written around the margins of each quilt. Willia Marie's adventures lead her to meet celebrities such as Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse, Josephine Baker, Zora Neale Hurston, Sojourner Truth, and Rosa Parks on the road to becoming herself an artist and businesswoman. The Sunflower Quilting Bee at Arles emphasizes a group of historically important Black women. So we see Mary McLeod Bethune, Sojourner Truth, and Rosa Parks, and they are themselves sitting here working on this sunflower pattern quilt. And yet we see there in the back Vincent van Gogh holding the sunflowers, almost kind of giving his approval, and the whole idea of the yellow houses in the field of sunflowers there. Ringgold actually traveled to Arles in the south of France to research her subjects, which she said were the implications of aesthetic modernism and the African-American expatriate experience. And just as a little bit of trivia, Oprah Winfrey now owns this quilt. It's just magnificent. So drawing on her own struggle for recognition in the art world that was really dominated by European traditions and male artists, Ringgold uses this narrative format to literally rewrite the past by weaving together histories of modern art, African-American culture, and personal biography. So this practice reflects the shift towards postmodernism in the art of the 1980s and 90s. In deliberate contrast to modernism's emphasis on autonomy and universal meaning, artists like Ringgold highlighted their implicit biases in accepted forms of art, especially in their treatment of race and gender. So characteristic is her use of appropriation, narrative, and biographical references, and non-Western traditions. Through these devices, Ringgold offers an alternative to the European and masculine perspectives that again were prevalent in art history. And this is exactly what the women's movement was about, was again, saying that we could be a part of this as well. And so here she has this beautiful Willia Marie and her family dancing at the Louvre. What a beautiful, exquisite artwork. Now, and this will be our last slide that we're taking a look at here. And I had talked earlier about how Ringgold came from a long line of creative women. And she had learned quilting and sewing from her mother, who learned it from her mother, and so on and so on. And here we see these ancestors reunited in Ringgold's Matisse's Chapel. The quilt portrays an imaginary reunion of the deceased members of her family seated together beneath Matisse's glowing windows. Her baby brother, her sister in a wedding dress, her father's brothers, and her grandparents have all come together in Vence. Now I have brought them here, Miss Ringgold said. My heritage follows me wherever I go. So I hope you have enjoyed this look at feminist art and Faith Ringgold, and just this idea that it wasn't to be against men or anything, but just that we are part, as women, part of the art history and part of history, and that our thoughts and feelings matter as well. So I look forward to seeing all of you who are going to do the art project with us. As you can see here, this was done. Our teacher is going to be Linda Callis for this artwork, and you are going to create kind of your own quilted Faith Ringgold inspired piece, where we'll do some painting in the middle and put some fabric around the outside. You can think of images that you might like from your own life story. That you know of that you want to put in here. This is of Linda's family. She actually used photographs. So if you wanted to gather photographs for this, but we'll provide all the materials for this, and we'll do our class together on Zoom. So thank you so very much for your attention. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you all in class. Take care. Thank you.